Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The Attorney General's Commission on Pornography has made its report, some 2,000 pages and 93 recommendations, whose bottom line is that pornography, at least hardcore pornography, is linked directly to sex crimes. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about that report, why we have a report, what the recommendations of that report are, and what the likelihood is that we'll have laws regarding that come from this report. Our panelists today are Dr. Louis Engelhardt, Professor Emeritus of Journalism at Ball State University, Dr. Greg Dixon, who is pastor of Temple Baptist Church in Indianapolis, and Dr. John Rouse from the Department of Political Science at Ball State University. John, what is the climate that, that brought us this commission, that brought us this report? Why do we have this commission at all when we've had, I guess, 1970, a report on another government commission that went the other way, that said, in fact, states probably ought to repeal laws that limit the sale of pornography to adult customers? Are things different now?
Yeah, I think we can look at several issues, of course. I think sex has become a very important issue in society. We won't say that perhaps even that maybe sex has replaced night baseball, but sex is a very important economic issue in society, and I think we could say a couple of things. First of all, in terms of affirmative action with women and the role of women in the marketplace. Just recently, the Supreme Court handed down a decision on sodomy involving homosexuals. And this is also a sexual kind of issue. So I think in a sense we have to look at the fact that the role of sex, economically, exploitation, these kinds of things, also, that's the first focus, I would say. The second focus, obviously, is the role of the new Christian right. And I think with this kind of report, the politics of these things, the politics of the new Christian right, in a way, through this, perhaps the new Christian right is realizing some of the values that they have fought for over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. So I would say, first of all, the issue of sex in general has been a big issue in society for the last several years, and also in terms of the realization of politics, the new Christian right perhaps is realizing some of its values through these kinds of things.
Is the fact that Ronald Reagan's in the White House now, that Ed Meese is Attorney General, does this create a climate that makes this kind of report more, I guess, more receptive? Is the administration, perhaps the mood of the country, more receptive to something like that?
Well, I think the new Christian right and the members of the new Christian right have felt that the administration has not lived up to what it promised. However, I think through the court system, to answer your question, that in the court system, through the appointees of judges, which is the thing that the president does, and also through the appointment of commissions, he has a great deal of influence. And so what the new Christian right has done, I believe, with these kinds of issues in the last several years is to raise the agenda. They have not had the control over the some of the legal or legislative aspects, but they have been able to raise the agenda, and then those who do have power have to respond to a new agenda. So I would say that the president has been very helpful to the new Christian right in this way.
Dr. Dixon, do we have a problem with pornography, as this report suggests, that we need some regulation through federal or state laws that in fact crack down on pornography dealers?
Well, Larry, in the first place, the tragic thing to me is this, that over the past I would say in the neighborhood of approximately 20 years, we have been getting governmental activism involved in the pornography field and the sex field in general, from the standpoint of legalizing pornography, licensing pornography. We've gone through the victimless crime syndrome here in this country, where various cities across America, and then it's been aided and abetted by the courts, both the lower and the higher courts, to where they have literally stripped the average citizen from all safeguards on pornography, prostitution, and the whole gamut of sexual promiscuity in the area of criminal activity. And so consequently, the Reagan administration in reality with this new commission on pornography is really just simply the pendulum swinging back to the right that had swung so far to the left with the Presidential Commission of 1970, of President Johnson's commission. You said something before we went on the air. Well, why would the government be involved in this to begin with? Well, why were they? Well, because the Presidential Commission of 1970 was the result of the liberal, leftist, libertinian thinking of those who had seized the apparatus of the Democratic Party primarily, and they influenced President Johnson. He was beholden to them for his unbelievable landslide in that when he was elected after the President Kennedy's assassination. And so the tragic thing is that government legalized illicit sex, in essence. Now the pendulum is swinging back to the right again.
Dr. Engelhardt, are you familiar with these laws that have legalized illicit sex?
Not really. The circumstances that are going on now are very similar to the time when Anthony Comstock was busy with his New York Society for Prevention of Vice. Actually, the far religious right is pale in comparison with his effectiveness. But nonetheless, these things tend to go in cycles. The Supreme Court has addressed this many times. Indeed, there are thousands and thousands of cases that have gone through the courts every year almost. And unfortunately, I had to read a lot of them because I wrote a couple of books, and I had to get familiar with press law thoroughly. And the result is that I find a lot of confusion about just what the courts are and what they have said and haven't said.
But the court has said what pornography is,
yes.
Right? And we're not, is nudity, is obscenity pornography?
No. I have something I can go very quickly through that might make it clear just what the position of the courts might be. The First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of the press, does not protect pornography. The courts have determined that that's a form of expression not protected by the First Amendment. But the courts then have to determine what pornography really is. They came out with a decision in 1973 based on a case concerning Mr. Miller in California, and that has established the legal definition of pornography. And it's not a bad definition. If you'll bear with me just 30 seconds, I can tell you what that is. First of all, the content must involve sexual conduct. The content must be presented in a way that appeals to a prurient or lascivious interest in sex, according to the reaction of an average person, as he or she understands the contemporary standards of the local community. These standards are determined by a trial jury or by the court, and not by other community agencies. Second, the content must portray in a patently offensive manner the sexual conduct as it's defined and forbidden by a valid state law. And third, the work, taken as a whole, must have serious literary, artistic, scientific, or political value. Now, to be declared obscene, the work must fail all three of these tests. If it survives any one of the three, it is not legally obscene. This means that single words, paragraphs, chapters, sections of books, magazines, or newspapers cannot establish legal obscenity. Courts do not consider profanity to be obscene, nor do they don't consider nudity alone to be obscene.
But this doesn't mean that the Supreme Court in 2 years or 4 years won't change that definition of pornography.
They came out with a definition something like this, first of all, in the Roth case, and 15 years later they tightened it up this way. Now they might, through litigation, come up with a tighter definition or a looser one.
Dr. Dixon, is this too narrow a definition? Should we be talking about things such as Playboy and Penthouse that are sold in convenience stores as pornography?
Well, I think the key to this whole thing, and what was the later Supreme Court decision?
This is the latest one.
Is that
That's
the one
another
that,
one.
I thought recently, though, there was one that talked about community standards
No,
may prevail.
that's what community standards are, is what the
I
jury
know, but I thought you
determines
said 1973 on
But
it.
Yeah,
local
that's
juries
right.
are allowed to determine community standards based on these criteria. That's the Miller decision, right?
Well, I'm very sorry, but I thought that there was a more recent Supreme Court decision that discussed the community standards aspect even more stringent than that, and I guess I'm mistaken on that.
Well, I'm not familiar with
Well,
it.
I'll bow to your... wasn't I correct
Let
on
me
that,
ask
John?
you, I'm not absolutely sure either, but let me get down to some crucial issues. I think as Dr. Dixon was saying, the perceived interference of the state through the courts into this issue has been evident over the last 15 years. But in terms of questions, let me ask both of you, what is the role of the state in enforcing the morality of its citizens? Just on a general focus in terms of this particular issue. What's the role of the state here?
Well, in the first place, it's a terrible thing that the state has to get involved with a moral issue of this kind. It's a terrible thing that society has come to the place where we have to ask the question, what is pornography or what is obscene? That unfortunately shows that something has happened to society over the past 100 years. 100 years ago, that question would not have been asked. Now,
Well, Reverend Dixon, it was.
well, I'm sure it was asked, but most people, there was more of a consensus then than there is now. Would you not agree to that?
No, I won't.
Well-
Not historically.
Okay, I'll challenge you on that. 100 years ago, I don't care what denomination the preacher was, you did not have preachers standing in the pulpit saying that fornication was all right, homosexuality was all right. You didn't have homosexual churches. Any church you walked into on a Sunday morning, every preacher, regardless of the denomination, that parishioner or the one who came to worship knew that premarital sex was a sin. They knew that sodomy was wrong. They knew that these things were wrong. There was absolutely no question among the clergy. Today there is a question among the clergy.
Well, of course, that's beyond the definition of pornography. Those are other fields that are important.
I'm talking about a consensus of the community.
They still go beyond that.
Well, going back to what Larry said a moment ago and going back to what you read, here's the thing that I see as important, and I want to try to answer John's question. The one ingredient that we're missing in this whole thing, in my opinion, is what you asked a moment ago. What is obscenity? In essence, that's what you said, is Playboy, is nudity, etc. In the United States of America, with our jury system, the jury has the right to determine that. And I think that the application of the Supreme Court decision is being prostituted all across America. We had an example of that in Indianapolis just recently when this fellow by the name of Walker was on trial. I think David Walker. And this jury had to sit there and be exposed to all kinds of statistics and expert witnesses to try to convince them that the community as a whole felt that that material that David Walker was selling was perfectly within a legitimate community standard platform, etc. My position is, and we must get this over to the juries, that jury had the right to make a decision as to what is obscene. That jury had the right.
And the jury convicted him.
That's correct. And no court has the right to overturn what that jury determined was obscene.
I'm afraid that's not the way the legal system works. A judge himself may refuse to accept a jury's verdict. And there are appeal systems that people can go to, and they do go to. That's how the Miller thing got to the Supreme Court for their defining things.
If the court finds that the jury disregarded constitutional issues.
You know,
That's the problem. A judge under our jurisprudence does not have the right to overturn the decision of that jury. That must be done on appeal. That jury is above the judge in our method of jurisprudence. And Larry, here's the problem that's taking place in criminal law all over America. The judge is saying to that jury in his instructions, and I've heard it over and over again, especially in liberty, even in religious liberty issues. The judge says to the jury, this is the law, this is what you must decide, this is the decision you must make. And the jury goes into that deliberation room, and many of these people are saying, well, why did he use a computer? What do we have a jury for? No, I disagree with Mr. Engelhardt. It's true that judges are doing what he said, but they do not have the right to do it constitutionally. They are usurping their responsibility.
Do we want local juries throughout this country then to be determining their community standards in regards to pornography, nudity, obscenity, or do we want state and federal laws, as this commission has recommended, to help fight pornography?
You cannot make, no court, no judge can come up with a definition of pornography.
If I could
Yes.
jump back in this thing and take us back to the politics of it all, obviously there is no consensus as far as what is pornography. Some people
Well,
would...
the Supreme Court judgment
You
is
have a working
the
definition. The Supreme Court says here's what you work
That's what
with.
it is. Now, there are a lot of other people who have different views about it. That's fine,
But that's
but that's it.
all.
Well, you know, given this kind of disagreement, how do we come up with some kind of consensus in our society?
We don't. That's an undesirable thing. Good heavens, you'd have to say to Dixon that mind prevails so he can't even think this way. Good heavens, thank goodness he is thinking. That's the whole basis. Is
See,
not
Mr. Engelhardt
consensus.
is absolutely correct. That's the reason that I keep trying to say there was another decision on community standards recently. But we've been living under this 1973 law that put the city of Indianapolis or Muncie or Podunk Hall or someplace in a position of having to say that whatever they tolerate in New York City must be tolerated in our community. But when the Supreme Court recently threw it back and said community standards may prevail, that was a wonderful thing.
Well, that was a Miller test. That was part of it.
Yes, well, it was a part of it, but it was a recent decision.
Well, I think part of the politics, of course, is the behavior of people. And if the records show that from 55 to 60 million people buy these videotape recorder VCR things, X-rated movies, and so you have a consumer out there who wants to purchase this kind of thing. You know, we talk about what happened 100 years ago in terms of the positions of pastors about this issue or that issue, but of course we live in a different kind of era, and that era, of course, is one of technology. So in a sense, Playboy and Penthouse, perhaps their consumer interest is going down because people can go into stores and buy X-rated VCRs.
Do we let the marketplace then determine community standards? Do we let the marketplace, if in fact an adult bookstore can remain open, can do business, can make a profit, then should it be allowed to exist in the community?
But John, the problem is this. It's one thing to say that this is what the community wants because of the sales success of some of these places, but it's another thing for government to put their approval upon it, to put their stamp of approval upon it through licensing. That's the position that I'm trying to say.
Well, there's no licensing of printed material permitted in this country.
But there's licensing of stores that print,
Well, that's a
publish
different
the
matter.
material.
That's a different matter.
I think part of the concern by some people is the fact that Alan Sears, who is the executive director of the commission that just finished, sent letters to certain convenience stores saying that they were now centers of pornography or they were selling pornographic materials. Of course, they were selling Penthouse and Playboy and so forth. Greg, don't you think that the New Christian Right forces are making progress in terms of raising this issue in the sense that now they're having an influence in keeping even Playboy and Penthouse out of the 7-Elevens and the village pantries and so forth around the country?
John, I feel that the pendulum has definitely swung back to the right. I also feel, however, that this is a fruit issue, and we're still not getting down to the real root issue. But I'm very pleased with the fruit. And until we can until we can address more of the root issues, I'm perfectly willing to be satisfied with the fruit that we're eating at the present time.
Well, I do believe that there's a lot of concern about pornography. I do believe that there are different views about it. I do not believe that the Christian right speaks for Christianity. I do not believe that the liberal left speaks for people. I believe that we have a diverse nation, and I believe under the basis of the Constitution, the fact that there can be a religious right is protected. The fact that there can be disturbing materials produced and distributed is protected. And indeed, the court is independent of the other branches of government, independent of the majority view. It is there to protect individual people in their views and what they prefer. And even if 95% of the people said there should be some things not published, the court is obligated under the Constitution to protect the minor voice, no matter how minor it is. And to simply say that you can't talk about these things is wrong. Now, if the thing is legally established to be pornographic, it can be regulated. But the difficulty with the religious right and other groups is that they want to make the law to encompass all of the things or many of the things they're unhappy with. And when you start writing laws like that, they simply do not pass constitutional muster.
This commission talked about making laws, state and federal laws, but in fact, is this commission looking for that kind of law, John, or are they trying to, or is this commission trying to establish a social climate whereby people are aware of and I don't know, contribute to the mindset that pornography is bad, that it does lead to sex crimes, therefore it should be banned or abolished? Is the commission really looking for law or looking to establish a mindset?
Okay, my impression is that they are definitely interested in making waves in the sense that the commission encouraged people to go and petition against centers of pornography. It also had a focus in terms of raising the agenda, as I said. 6 of the 11 members of the commission had definitive stands against pornography. So in a sense, it was set up in terms of that kind of focus. There was no real emphasis in terms of research. There is a great deal of concern in terms of the research that says that persons viewing pornography then cause crimes later on. So I think it's a political thing. It is not a legal thing. But if I can get back to another point that both Lou and Greg made, it's interesting to me that both of you apparently are saying that government should not be involved in this kind of activity. Is that correct?
I don't know what you mean by that. The government must protect the minority.
Is that what you said, Greg?
I said it's a shame that they had to become involved in these things. It's too bad that society cannot govern themselves. It's too bad that society cannot control themselves. It's too bad that we cannot have self-control, that we have these predators. There's overwhelming evidence that child molestation, sodomy, rape, all of these things are the direct result of pornography. We have, there's all kinds of statistics showing that these porn, people drive down the street and they see adult bookstore, XXX. They need to understand that there is a direct link between that XXX and organized crime. The crime bosses have moved into this. Now, it's the responsibility of government to protect the citizens as a whole from these predators upon society. And when we cannot control ourselves, then unfortunately we will have government control. History shows that.
But isn't that an issue of government or legislatures attempting to legislate morality?
Pornography and some of the conduct he's talking about goes beyond morality. It's criminal.
That's it.
And let me tell you that the problems of child pornography, no court anywhere has ever upheld that as a desirable thing. No legislature ever has. No one has. There are severe penalties for child pornography, and they've been in effect for several years. And I think probably somebody needs to keep alerting authorities to take action. But the law is totally against child pornography. And that's not an issue legally. It's the government stands totally against that, and the entire government apparatus is there to control it. So I don't think that's the issue that it could be.
The issue is how much further do you go in controlling pornography as the community perceives it, as a state legislature perceives it, as the Congress perceives it.
It has to pass constitutional muster, and if it accords with the Miller decision, you can have reasonable rules and regulations. If it defies that, you're in trouble constitutionally.
But if you can regulate child porn, you can regulate other forms of pornography.
No, there's a double standard, a lesser standard that started with the Ginsburg case, where they said children may be regulated, or material going to children can be regulated more severely and strictly than for adults.
I'm certainly willing to rely upon the community standard decision of the Supreme Court. We have to depend upon that. Whether we like it or not, we have to depend upon that jury system. And that puts a tremendous amount of responsibility upon ministers, upon editors, upon everyone who forms public opinion in this country.
Greg, let me get back.
Quickly, because we're out of time.
Isn't this really a family issue? If families teach their kids not to read this kind of material, isn't that the place where it has to be solved?
Well, that's public opinion has to begin to be formed there. But it's one thing for me to teach my child that pornography is bad. It's another thing for him to walk right out and be grabbed by these predators that are waiting for him. And I think that we have the right to expect some help from the government, from whatever level that is.
We're out of time today. Thanks to our guests today, Dr. Greg Dixon, Dr. Louis Englehart, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.